Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us recommends a record for everyone else to hear, and then we all review it and talk about it. And this week we are going to be talking about Morgan's recommended record, an album that I think was inevitable that we talk about eventually on this podcast, the gospel debut record, The Moon is a Dead World. If you're wondering, hey, did you all talk about their new second album? Yes, we did. Go check that out. But
Absolutely.
now we're here. And Morgan, why did you decide that we should talk about Gospel's The Moon is a Dead World, other than all of the reasons that we would want to talk about such a record?
It's nice when we can complete as many discographies as possible. And they only had one other album that we haven't reviewed. And the album that we haven't reviewed is a fucking classic.
Yeah.
So
for the listeners at home who maybe don't know who Gospel are, seemingly unlikely, but I'll go through the spiel anyway. Gospel are a Brooklyn-based hardcore band, released one classic record in 2005, the one we're talking about today, then kind of just disappeared off the map. Really a one and done type deal until, of course, this year where they came back with a long awaited and incredibly satisfying sophomore release, The Loser, which we did review a few months ago. But what distinguishes Gospel, I think, makes them really, really special is that they're not just another hardcore band. They are a hardcore band that fuse elements of the screamo side of really aggressive hardcore, unwound sort of by way of envy-esque sort of stuff. But they also fuse that with progressive rock influences as well. You have the presence of instrumentation and of kind of organs and tones and synthesizers and keys and stuff that give it a much more sort of King Crimson-y feel. And I often see them compared to like King Crimson and sort of being like King Crimson by way of like, I don't know, Drive Like Jehu or something. But there's so much their own.
I'd say at the drive-in.
At the drive-in, really good comparison as well. So much their own band, so much having their own distinctive sound. Emerged from the ashes of the even more raucous but short-lived hardcore band Helen of Troy. And so these guys had essentially Adam Dooling, Sean Miller, Vincent Roseboom, and John Pasteur. Essentially, these guys had been making music together for several years. They were seasoned. They'd been in additional bands and stuff. And so they were ready, I think, by the time that Gospel formed and they lay down to record this, which incidentally was recorded with Kurt Ballou in 10 days. This album was laid down. It was very, very quick recording sessions, and it was sort of like these were songs that the band had obviously prepared and the songs that the band had obviously carefully composed. When you listen to this record, you can tell how carefully composed these songs are. They're not just mindless bashing around. There is complexity to the arrangements. There's real structure to the songs that does harken back to a kind of prog metal influence in some ways. You have tracks like the epic 9-minute Golden Dawn, which is probably still my favorite Gospel track, that absolutely showcase how this band can lay out this furious template and find ways to extend and expand it over longer runtimes. Though it should be said, it is a really tight record. It's just under 40 minutes, and it never really gives you enough time to get bored with it or to kind of accept and even get used to the kind of palette that it's working with. It's really aggressive. It's really full throttle. And it's no wonder that being the sole record that this band released for such a long time, it kind of eventually became heralded as a cult classic. It's a record where I would say its reputation has built up over time as opposed to kind of being instantly canonized. And yeah, it's super cool that we're talking about it now, because when we reviewed The Loser, that was kind of a really short sort of brief segment where we kind of just highlighted what was cool about this band and why it was awesome that they're back. But now I think we have a chance to really talk about the sound that they kind of pioneered in the mid 2000s and how essentially unique and awesome it is.
Knowing these boys are from Brooklyn makes a whole lot of sense.
yeah, I mean, there's so many comparison points that tend to come up when you bring up this band, yet I don't think any of them really do it justice. Like there's even on the Loser, even on this album before the Loser, which I think is even more jazz inflected than this, you can hear the influence of so much really out there jazz on a record like this, more so than any post-hardcore record that I can think of. I think that's where a lot of the King Crimson comparison comes in, because they were influenced by so much of the same stuff, as well as this band also being subsequently influenced by King Crimson itself. I think that mostly comes through on the drum performances on here, which are just like, how many arms does this man have? Is this
Yeah.
the octopus
Too
from
many,
Aquaman?
debatably.
So another example, I feel like we've talked about many of these, of like a drummer who has like a perfect name for a drummer. Vincent Rose Boom. Like he literally has Boom in his name. Like,
oh my god, whoever named their child after like a borderline Final Fantasy name, that's like that you destined that boy to be a prog rock drummer. Like,
I mean, never,
thank you.
seldom do you get such boldly obvious cases for nominative determinism as a genuine thing. Like you're called Vincent Roseboom, then you're going to grow up and you're going to make beautiful loud noise. But yeah, as I said, this
it's like
band,
if the bassist was named Vibrate McNasty.
so funny because like the bassist is just called
rules.
Sean Miller, which is just the most like
Oh,
whatever name. But
doesn't he
anyway,
do Hot Ones?
as I was saying, Gospel emerged from the ashes of a really scrappy hardcore band called Helen of Troy that 3 of the 4 members were in. And the big distinction was with Gospel, they added Jonathan Pasteur, who is the keyboardist, who is responsible for a lot of the sounds of this band that I think bring them out of just the kind of typical hardcore landscape that they were existing in. A huge part of what separates this band in terms of their sound is the contributions of John Pasteur. And so once this quartet had formed, it was almost like the ideas were spilling out of them. And what's interesting, something I didn't really get to mention when we talked about The Loser, is that like they had like a lot of what you heard on the album that came out this year was originally envisioned, composed, written around the same time as this album. And they were originally planning on following it up really, really quickly, but there were lots of clashes in terms of creative decisions, and also the exhaustion of touring that ended up kind of putting the band on a really long-term hiatus. That song, that highlight from their new record Tango, was actually originally released as a single in 2010. And then the album was still 12 years away. But all of these pieces of information, I think, serve to only make the existence of The Moon is a Dead World and the kind of perfection of it even more impressive. It's like it came around as well. Like I feel like one of the reasons why, I mean, The Loser's certainly been really, really embraced and accepted within like the sort of niche hardcore community, I suppose, online places like Rate Your Music. But I feel like even with The Moon is a Dead World, Gospel were kind of arriving at the post-hardcore party a few years too late to really be fully canonized and, you know, held up on the level of hardcore bands like Converge when they were working with Kurt Ballou, and like Drive Like Jehu and all of these other reference points. They kind of arrived a little bit too late. And despite the fact that they were doing something really novel and interesting with the sound, it's almost like hardcore music in terms of popularity, niche, cultural relevance sort of died down in the early 2000s and has only really come back into the sphere of popular alternative music in the last couple of years with bands like The Armed, again, the Kurt Ballou connection, Turnstile as well. This kind of like really aggressive music that is owing more and more to the tradition that was laid out by bands like Gospel is coming back into popularity now, I think, as is maybe that was part of the reason behind getting The Loser out when it did come out, is based on the success of bands like The Armed and Turnstile. And so now I think it's fitting to go back and retroactively try even more to bring this record to the spotlight, because it has an unfriendly, sort of dark, very kind of like black metal-esque album cover that also has some kind of like, I don't know, I look at that album cover and I get like shades of black metal and gent with the like weird sort of geometric patterns and stuff. It doesn't look very friendly. And also the title as well makes me think of like a real sort of like black metal-esque sort of dark, gruesome stuff, which I think betrays just how colorful this album can be. And it's still really intense and dark and all those brooding things, but there's a strong melodic sense. There's a really great heft to the riffs, and there's just a continually engaging and exciting sense of energy and creativity, sort of motivating and pushing this band. Yeah, I mean, what do you guys think about this record, and what sort of stands out to you about this album?
I mean, not to be a stereotypical fucking Sally or anything, but I like it when any genre decides to be proggy.
Stereotypical Sally.
That's a thing.
I've been awake for an hour, so I just need you all to know that I'm probably feeling extra unhinged today, which I'm
Beautiful.
honestly very appropriate considering the album in question that we're talking about. But it's kind of easy, like as much as I want to go back and like smack the people in 2006 just to be like, hey, why didn't you fucking get on this sooner? When you look at the hardcore scene around then, it was mainly focused on, like, again, we talk about the ubiquitousness of a band like Converge, which I think kind of spearheaded that sort of movement. And around this time, they were making music that was just like, okay, what if we did Jane Doe, but like again, but like nastier? Like they were just getting heavier and heavier and heavier. So when something like this comes along that's like way more like decentralized when it comes to its genre, it makes sense that people maybe didn't latch on to it in that way. And hell, around the same time, I would think that like if I could recommend this band to people in general, I would say that again, fans of At the Drive-In and the Mars Volta will be at home here, not just because it shares sensibilities with that band, but because it shares an irreplicable uniqueness that that band also kind of contains. But in 2006, that was when Amputexture came out. And at the time, that's when people's general interest in bands like the Mars Volta just began to wane. So even people who would have been geared towards this are kind of being steered in a different direction. So you get this album that like has these absolutely like intergalactically weird guitar tones. That's my favorite like sonic choice about this record, is that all over it, every single song, every guitar tone, I'm just like, I'm not a music person in terms of like technicality. I don't know how you go about making albums sound specifically like this, but I don't think I've heard guitar tones that are this weird sounding, like on my favorite track on here, which is the penultimate track, What Means of Witchery, which like this song is from hell. This song is evil. I fuck with it. I want to roll it up into a joint and smoke it. Actually, if I like listen to this album high, I'd probably have a panic attack. But like, even in compared to The Loser, which I narrowly prefer just because that's a little bit more my bag than this is in particular. But this album specifically just feels like it contains so much raw, unbridled, almost nervous tension within it that it feels like it has like not in sound necessarily, but almost in structure. I would compare it a lot to post rock. There's so much when it goes into the idea of tension dispersal when you have an album that is so focused on these wacky time signatures and these weird choices and this weird genre bending. And within an album that's so short, you wouldn't really expect them to take that kind of approach. But that's why this album feels like exactly its length. It doesn't feel too long. It doesn't feel too short. It feels perfectly substantial because it's paced basically flawlessly. Every time they come and like introduce a new melodic idea, you're just kind of like right at the edge of still enjoying the previous one. This is an album that like the first time I heard it, I immediately replayed it over again just because A, it's kind of the perfect length to do that, and because it's like listening to like, or it's like reading like a particularly great work of literature where you kind of have to keep doubling back and rereading sentences just to like grasp the portentous like weight of what the prose is actually doing. It sounds really like pretentious, but in a way, it's just like that makes it all the more raw and like unbridled and fun for me. This album's just sort of like it feels like you're being tossed inside of a washing machine that's like in space. It's dope.
There's a few elements to the record that I've picked up on over the many times I've listened to it that I think really distinguish it from like so much of the music that it gets compared to. For one, I think there is a psychedelic tinge to what this band do. It's a really heavy psychedelia. It's certainly aided by the keyboard playing of John Pasteur to a huge extent, but like the way that the songs are structured as well, like you have some of the aesthetic signifiers of something like post-rock, and I've already, of course, mentioned the prog thing, but it's like these songs aren't structured or they don't build and disperse in the way that that kind of music does. It kind of like it sets you up with that expectation, then it just becomes something much more almost jazzy at certain points as well, just in terms of the way that the songs progress, and like they don't have traditional sort of climax points or moments of like heft that feel like they're built to. They kind of like have these heavy moments that sort of just melt into jammier spaces that the songs can kind of like just exist within.
Very Dillinger Escape Plan.
Yeah, I think Golden Dawn and What Means of Witchery are the best examples of this, probably because they're the longest songs on the record and they really let you exist in that space. But even if you think about the opening track, or the first two tracks, really, Congratulations, You've Hit Bottom and Your Electric Surge is Sweet. Like these are songs that for a band like this, and for music in a style like this, these are quite kind of affronting sort of like lumbering songs. Like they don't really go very far with any of their musical ideas. They kind of just focus, well, let me rephrase that. They have a small number of musical ideas that they kind of riff on and just sort of like explore how they can sound tonally, like how psychedelic they can make them sound, how sludgy they can make them sound. They're not these huge, the album doesn't start with these like massive sort of suites of complex shifting parts like a band like At the Drive-In or the Mars Volta would, for instance. They kind of have this more meditative at times, kind of like jammy tone to them, where they'll just kind of riff on an idea and they'll kind of explore the tones and how it sounds, the interplay between the musicians as well. One of the things that makes this band so great is it's not just four great musicians playing four great individual parts at any given moment. There is a real sense of synergy and interplay. Like there are points on the record, I think it happens on As Far As You Can Throw Me, and I think it happens on another song as well, multiple songs, but there's points where you can feel like the Adam Dooling or Sean Miller kind of like egging on Vincent Roseboom, the drummer. Like you can feel the musicians kind of pushing each other in real time, even though these are kind of very much composed compositions. You can feel a sense of interplay and a sense of real sort of like live action sort of happening in the studio as these songs are progressing. The whole thing, it's kind of really hard to describe that feeling, but the whole thing does have this, it gives the whole record this sense of kind of like urgency and unpredictability, even when you've heard it a lot, where you kind of just trust that you're in the hands of musicians who know what they're doing and who are absolutely resolutely determined to not take any individual musical idea and do anything remotely predictable with it, to kind of like have that, standard post-rock build and release or anything like that. One of the things that's so pleasing about this record to listen to again and again and again is that you get great musical ideas and you get them developed and pushed into places that most bands wouldn't even think to do. I could see it making this album as a whole feel somewhat standoffish or maybe a little bit more difficult to get into, just because like a lot of
Yes,
the death metal bands that we talk about, you know, some of the more extreme sort of tech death metal bands, like sometimes the technicality and the interest in like moving so far away from conventional compositional structure makes it music that is confrontational to listen to, and sort of like you have to rewire your brain a little bit to kind of understand, okay, here's what these guys are doing with this song. It's not just the typical, you know, iterating a riff over and over again, you know, and moving on to the next thing. It is, you know, it reminds me, actually another band that I thought of while listening to this is KO Dot, like specifically early KO Dot, Wires of
Yeah.
the Eye type era, where they are, I think KO Dot experiment a little bit more with timbre and just kind of like, because those, that first record is like, has incredibly loud and just kind of like overwhelming sequences, but also has incredibly ambient sequences as well. And the mixing on that, those early KO Dot records is really kind of like purposefully feels like it's trying to drown you in a kind of like miasma of sounds, whereas everything here, in the very typical Kurt Ballou fashion, everything here is very distinct, very three-dimensional, very hard-edged, particularly the bass and drums, which Kurt is just great at bringing that sound out. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why
bass
he's
is
such a,
like the unspoken hero of this entire album.
yeah, 100%. Like, you get Kurt Ballou on a record because you want everything to sound like he's, I'm trying to think of a good like reference point for production for him for like a non extreme music standpoint, but he's like, I guess, the Sean Everett of metal or something, where it's like,
You know, yes, basically. I mean, in the sense that their sensibilities are like totally opposite. You know, there's something to the King Crimson comparison that I find here is like, I feel like you can separate prog into two separate camps these days, and that being progressive in genre and progressive in spirit. And this feels a little bit of both, but more progressive in spirit. And that I think this is like, this could be seen as like the in the court of the Crimson King of the in the world of this particular alternative metal niche, because this is also an album that has inspired many musicians to have gone and like done similar things after this. And it feels like this being a sort of centralized reference point ends up being kind of inevitable when you make music that's so innovative and fresh feeling, to the point where it feels like one of the last truly like progressive albums of the 21st century. Like, there's lots of great notable progressive rock and progressive metal albums and bands that have come post 2000, and a lot of ones that I love, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them to be progressive in spirit like I would gospel. They more just borrow it in terms of sound and less
yeah.
in like structure and ethos.
One thing I really love just reading on their Wikipedia page in terms of the influences that they have cited is like Roseboom said that the biggest influence on them was Peter Gabriel era Genesis, specifically like
Jesus Christ.
Selling them by the pound and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is like a big reference point for them. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because
No.
that's like very sort of, and I say this endearingly as someone who loves those records, that's very sort of chintzy music box, unusual prog, where you have a real emphasis on flair and charisma over aesthetics, I would say, in a lot of ways. And
theatrical.
And of course, like, fittingly, also they cite influences like Primus, Minutemen, Jane's Addiction as well. So many other bands like that I associate with heavy music, but not heavy music that is like, you know, about aesthetics or about I guess taste, and more about kind of just being messy and noisy and pulling things together from different points that make them sound
to a lesser extent, maybe something
crazy.
like the Jesus Lizard, something a little bit more rough and tumble. Yeah,
I mean, they talk about the influence of Minutemen in the same sort of interview as they talk about the influence of Mahavishnu Orchestra and Miles Davis and that sort of stuff as well. So that, I think, really comes through in a big way. There's also another distinct aesthetic thing about this record, and I'm no guitar expert, so I'm happy to defer to Morgan or anyone else on this, but I believe Adam Dooling plays a 12-string on this album, which is just like, there is so much tonality to the playing as well. Like, it's really dynamic, and there's like a lot of flavor and edge and variation in the tones of the guitars, if that makes any sense. I'm worried I'm going to sound like I'm just spewing words out here, but
No,
like
you're good.
one of the things that characterizes the guitar tones on this record, and Jake, you kind of already alluded towards this, is how sort of like colorful they can be and how sort of like unconventional they can be. And I think a big part of that is the use of less conventional gear, I suppose.
It's a little hard to tell just by the ear when a 12 string is being played, or when an electric 12 string is being played. It's a lot less distinct than a acoustic 12 string. But it is, that's part of why so much of this album sounds so distinct tonally. I really think, just on the note of Baloo and his influence on albums like this, I really think he is like the Robert Fripp of extreme music. Not just in production and influence, but the way he plays is so idiosyncratic and specific to him. I think that comparison really holds up.
The only thing observably wrong about gospel in this album is that still, even with its cult classic status, not enough people have heard it to properly assess and or be influenced by it.
Yeah. A nice little quote that I found as well that I think speaks to the idea of how you can kind of feel these musicians pushing each other is there's a quote from Adam Dooling that says like, if you were to give Vinny a nice suggestion about what to play, you'd be received with nothing but animosity. Everyone has a specific style that I don't think would work if you were playing with other musicians. So there's this idea where it's a collaborative record in the sense that it is musicians working together and playing off of each other, but it is also a record in the sense that each individual musician has their own specific style and will at any given moment do whatever the fuck they want or play a part in whatever the fuck way they want. And the other members of the band have to kind of be able to react to that. And that's an attribute, I think, of a lot of the best, really like seasoned musicians, like proper conventional sort of rock band setup bands, is that ability to play off of each other like that. And I think it's also one of the things that distinguishes really exciting, inventive, great prog from prog that is just a little bit more boilerplate or just a little bit more, it might actually be still really, really good prog. I mean, we're very, very, forgiving and generous towards prog on this show, but there is definitely a distinction. And I think that gospel would echo this between,
Unless you're the pineapple thief.
I think there's maybe like a distinction between
hacking,
distinction between like, I don't know, Dream Theater and what's a prog band that's a bit closer to gospel. I guess the Mars Volta, I suppose. Like, yeah,
they're the only band that approaches this one in terms of like modern idiosyncrasies. Like, it's why I would recommend it to people, just because it has that sort of, like, again, the band like the Mars Volta is difficult to recommend to people because there's so few reference points that fit them wholly, but there's also like a little unique spice that comes from those individual players and those individual styles that you feel like you just cannot get anywhere else. So you just kind of like, you have to go here for this specific blend of genres and dynamics. Otherwise, it's just like, it's so wholly singular that you're just never going to get anything else like it. Even on the band's follow-up to this album, I mean, like, The Loser is very similar in many ways, but I think it's also like that album is more different than it is similar to this one, which makes this band even more of like a miracle somehow. And then you listen to that EP they put out this year and you're just like, oh, but they can also do like fucking Dream Theater Prog too.
yeah,
Why doesn't this band have like 40 albums? I'm so pissed.
yeah,
I think part of it is that, like, that being met with animosity attitude. I think this happens with a lot of bands that are, can't say short-lived anymore, but bands like this that have one album and then go away for a really long time, is that kind of attitude can often have, or not necessarily attitude, but just way of being, can have a sort of lightning in a bottle effect in terms of the process by itself. And I think that can make long-term collaboration a little difficult. But I also think that's what makes albums like this special, is that maybe they only come around once every 20 years or so.
Mm. All right. Well, shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings then for The Moon is a Dead World by Gospel? Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite tracks gotta be What Means of Witchery, the song that comes before it, Opium, is also fantastic. Generally speaking, the fucking final stretch of 3 songs on this record is just as good as post-hardcore it gets. And I'll also say, yeah, definitely Golden Dawn. That's sort of the early album highlight for me. And yeah, this album's terrific. My least favorite track is probably the sort of the center track here, And Redemption Fills the Emptiest of Hearts. And it's not even because it's like a lesser track, it's really just that it's so short. And this album's brevity is a strength, don't get me wrong, but it's the one spot on the album where I'm just like, I just wish you made this one longer. So that's probably my least favorite track, and I give the album an 8.5 out of 10.
All right, Morgan.
I've listened to this album whole so many times that it's hard to break them up into pieces. Like when I was moving to this house, I basically would throw this on and had it on exclusively for like a 7-hour period. So it's difficult, but I will say Golden Dawn, congratulations, you've hit bottom, and What Means of Witchery. No least favorites, 10 out of 10.
Nice. August couldn't join us, but he has the album at a 6 out of 10. So a ringing endorsement. My three favorite tracks are Golden Dawn. I'll put Paper Tigon in there. I really love that song. And yeah, What Means of Witchery, I think, is just unquestionably a standout. Least favorite track is probably, again, I love every song on this record. I'd say probably Your Electric Surge is sweet if I had to pick one, but I really like that. I like Redemption Fills the Emptiest of Hearts purely because it is the shortest thing here, but it also might be the most kind of batshit and loud thing here. So I kind of respect the game there. But yeah, this album is a masterpiece. It gets a very, very solid 9 out of 10 from me, which means overall we get an average of 8.4 for Gospels. The Moon is a Dead World. Let us know at home what this album means to you, what you think of this record, how you think it compares to the new Gospel record, if you've heard that too. If you haven't heard one or either, go and listen to those bad boys. There will be a link in the description. There will have probably been a card in this video for as well, our review of the new Gospel album, The Loser. We're huge fans of this band. We love bands like this. So if this band is your bag, then this channel likely will be too. So hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, so you don't miss our future reviews. You can also, if you want to, support us even further. You can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, become part of the Jams and Tea family, get your name featured in the title crawl of each video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us music to listen to and talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Milky Way. Life's better than Milky Way.